Nestled in a busy neighborhood in Queens, New York, is the home of Lewis Latimer. Musician, artist, poet, Civil War veteran, inventor, draftsman, and electrical innovator. Latimer's story is seldom told.
Lewis Latimer was somebody who gave great contributions to the industry of electric lighting, which in turn greatly enriched the lives of average Americans as a whole. And you know, he's certainly not somebody whose name is synonymous with the field of electric light, let alone his own inventions.
Lewis's father, George Latimer, was a slave in Virginia, and in 1842, George is given permission to marry another slave, Rebecca Smith. Later that same year, George and his new bride escaped to Boston. Both George and Rebecca's owners immediately published runaway slave notices, and 11 days after his escape, George Latimer is arrested, and Rebecca, fearing for her life, goes into hiding. George's arrest ignites the city of Boston. Abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, rallied to George Latimer's cause. Petitions, publications, and protests secure money to buy George's freedom. From all the attention, George Latimer becomes an icon in the struggle for freedom. In 1848, George and Rebecca welcomed Lewis, their fourth child. While in grammar school, Lewis, a dedicated student, shows an interest in reading and drawing, though much of his time is spent working with his father. When Lewis is around 10 years old, George leaves the family, and Rebecca, now a single parent, sends Lewis and his brothers to a state institution known as a farm school. At age 16, Lewis enlists in the Union Navy and serves honorably on a gunboat during the Civil War. After the war, Latimer returns to Boston, and through a lucky circumstance, he obtains a job as an office boy at Crosby, Halstead & Gold, a patent law firm. Latimer intently observes the draftsman, as his artistic interests spur a curiosity in drafting. He buys books and drafting instruments and teaches himself mechanical drawing. His talents are recognized, and later he becomes a draftsman for the firm. At the time, draftsmen played a key role in securing a patent because drawings were critical to patent applications.
A patent also has to explain what your invention looks like, or what it has to look like. You have to imagine that this is something that's never existed before. So having a skilled draftsman who's able to actually illustrate what your vision is a really important part of a successful patent.
In the mid-1870s, Latimer spends long hours working closely with inventor Alexander Graham Bell, drafting the images needed to secure a patent for the invention Bell calls the telephone.
Working with Alexander Graham Bell in that kind of intimate way really put Lewis on the path to becoming interested in inventing himself.
Managerial changes at Crosby, Halstead & Gold leads Latimer to quit. In 1879, he leaves Boston and moves to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he works in a machine shop and one day meets inventor Hiram Maxim, who was the chief engineer and founder of the United States Electric Lighting Company, a major competitor of Thomas Edison's incandescent lamp and electric light system. In February 1880, Maxim hires Latimer, and in June, Latimer and his family follows the company to New York City.
And Maxim develops his own incandescent light in the shape of an M after his name. And Latimer is one of the people he hires. He's involved in working in the manufacturing, developing the manufacturing process for the Maxim lamp. He takes out a couple of patents on improvements in the lamp and the manufacturing process. Later, Maxim sends him to England to help set up the lamp factory in London.
While moving to London may have intrigued Latimer, his actual experience proves to be less than ideal, as his British employees are not used to taking orders from a black man, and there was a continual effort to discount him.
To be able to deal with that on a daily basis and not, lose your cool and argue back, and I think he was very well aware of what his position was and how unique it was, and how important it was for him to prove people wrong at every step of the way, but with grace.
He comes back, he works for some other electrical companies, and then 1888-89, he begins to work for Edison General Electric as a patent expert.
So Latimer finds himself in a very unique position in that he has 11 years experience working for a patent law firm, and he also knows intimately the ins and outs of the electric lighting industry.
In 1890, he even published a little book on the Edison system and the development of the incandescent light by Edison. And he becomes a patent expert. In a sense, he's arguing for why Edison's patent should be fundamental and supersede Maxim's and other patents related to electric light.
In 1918, Latimer becomes a founding member of the Edison Pioneers, a group organized to preserve the legacy of Thomas Edison. Latimer was the only African American in the organization. In 1912, Lewis Latimer paints this self-portrait. While Latimer was obviously documenting a moment in time, the painting allows those who study him to ponder if this image really reflected his life as one of the earliest successful African American inventors.
Welcome. I'm Regina Myer, president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership. I am so glad everyone is here this afternoon to discuss not just the wonderful work of Lewis Latimer, but to hear from Shervone Neckles and our wonderful panel about the Beam Center's work and Shervone's vision to bring Lewis Latimer's work to light. As the president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, I am so pleased to let you all know that we, in 2019, we received funding from New York State under the Downtown Revitalization Initiative to fund public art in the downtown Brooklyn and DUMBO area. And we could not have received this grant at a better time. And we knew how lucky and fortunate we were to be able to support the arts at a time during COVID and during a time of political and cultural change, that we were able to support art, and understanding that public art has the ability to bring us not only together, but also to lead us. And we were able to fund 12 different projects in the downtown Brooklyn area. Please go to our website to learn more about that. Today, I really only want to focus on the work of Shervone's work with the Beam Center here today. I would like to, with that introduction, introduce you to Zelly Lewis, who is the Beam Center Director of Communication.
Hi, thank you, Regina. It's wonderful to be here today with everyone, and we're so happy to see so many of you joining us in the audience. As Regina said, my name is Zelly Lewis. I am the Director of Communications at Beam Center, and we were part of the initial creation of this beacon sculpture with Shervone, and we're thrilled to be co-presenting this at Downtown Brooklyn Partnership and the Lewis Latimer House Museum. I just wanted to give a quick rundown of kind of rules of engagement for this program. We do have both a chat box and a Q&A box. Please put any questions that you have for our panelists in the Q&A box. We will get to those later around 3:30 or 3:45, and then I will pass those along to your panelists for you at that time. But feel free to use the chat to ask your co-attendees questions, to ask for technical assistance. You can even you should be able to privately message me, Zaylee Lewis, in the chat function as well. At this time, I am thrilled to welcome our panelists to our virtual stage. The first one that I'll introduce is Ran Yan, the Executive Director of the Lewis Latimer House Museum. Then we have Prathibha Kanakamedala. She is an assistant professor in history at the Bronx Community College and at the Graduate Center at CUNY. We have Brian Cohen, who is the Executive Director at Beam Center. And then, of course, we have Shervone Neckles, who is a wonderful interdisciplinary artist and part of what brought all of us together today. At this time, I will pass it off to Shervone, who will kick off our panel discussion for us. And I will see you again for the Q&A session at the end.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Zaylee. And thank you, Regina, for your opening remarks and introduction. Just welcoming everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out on your Sunday afternoon to be here with us. And you know what? I think we should just jump right in and get started with me sharing a bit more about Beacon. And then followed by me sharing about Beacon, I will then segue into our conversation with our panelists. So I hope that sounds good to you all. So here we are, first image. And so this is Beacon at the ribbon cutting ceremony last fall. This is at Albee Square Plaza, downtown Brooklyn. And I am in the center and I'm joined by Beam Center staff. I'm also joined by Beam Center fellows, as well as the downtown Brooklyn partners. And at that ceremony, I had referred to the installation of Beacon as a homecoming for me. And I called it a homecoming because I grew up in the Flatbush, Brooklyn area. So downtown Brooklyn holds just so much history and memory for me. And it's very much a part of my formative years. I mean, I remember being a young girl shopping on Fulton Street with my mom during the holidays. I remember my aunt used to work just a couple of blocks away from Albee Square Plaza. So anytime I was in the neighborhood, I would go visit her. And then my high school girlfriends and I used to meet up at Albee Square Plaza, and we would go shopping for sneakers and we would go buy the latest mixtapes. And, you know I'm dating myself when I say mixtapes, but that's what we did back then. But I never would have imagined, honestly, that I would have had a career as an artist or even envisioned having an artwork installed in a public space where I grew up shopping with mom, visiting family, and hanging out with high school girlfriends. So it is very much a full circle moment for me and a homecoming. So here's the interesting thing. It's not only a homecoming for me, it's also a homecoming for who Beacon is about and inspired by. The brilliance and the ingenuity of this great American inventor and pioneer electrical engineer, Lewis Howard Latimer, who's on the left-hand side. And you're seeing a rendering of Beacon on the right-hand side. Now, another interesting fact is that Lewis Latimer and his wife, Mary Wilson Latimer, actually lived walking distance from where Beacon is installed right now in Albee Square Plaza. They lived on Adelphi between Myrtle and Willoughby, and they lived there between like 1893 to about 1902. So that would have made downtown Brooklyn their neighborhood too. And I have to admit that those are the things, learning about these things, that I really enjoyed about this process and journey that Beacon has taken me through. It has exposed me to and also reconnected me to American history. It has, it also connected me to New York history and just our collective history. And it really expanded my view of what homecoming really means, because it's not only about returning home, it's also about having a better understanding of home, right? An understanding of where I'm from and where I live and all the history that is there. So just a phenomenal thing for me. So, okay, who is Lewis Latimer? For those of you who are joining us who may be new to him. So Lewis Latimer's inventions and his collaboration with other great inventors like Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison and Hiram Maxim are the reason we have a lot of the technology we have today. And technology like the telephone and the light bulb and the electrical lighting systems that powers our homes and workspaces. So it's Lewis Latimer's contributions to those inventions that continues to influence and impact the quality of our lives to this present day. But it's more specifically the creation of the specific processing in the carbon filament that improved Thomas Edison's incandescent light bulb. And that improvement allowed for it to last longer, be more cost effective and easier to mass produce. So what you're seeing here on screen are two of the patents that I got a chance to discover when I spent time at the Lewis Latimer House Museum, and then had a chance to actually see them in person at his archives in the Queens Central Library. So as a result of Lewis Latimer's invention, light just became more accessible to everyone at that time. I mean, it really changed the way people were able to live in the 1880s. It changed the way they were able to literally see, but it also changed the way they were able to live, move, and function and operate in the world. And so Beacon, the sculpture Beacon, is really a gesture of remembering Lewis Latimer's legacy, honoring his ingenuity and his labor. So now the design also has this interactive component for those who haven't visited Beacon yet. So Beacon activates depending on one's proximity or interaction with the piece, because it has these built-in proximity sensors. So based on one's, like I said, proximity or interaction with the sculpture, the filament on the inside of the sculpture will emit a kind of pulsing light that fades in and out of full illumination, right? And it's kind of doing it at the pace of like a heart rate or our breathing patterns. And so when the viewer actually steps away from Beacon or outside of the proximity sensors, that's when the filament will slowly fade out and then completely turn off. Now, for me, this interactive feature is really meant to illuminate and remind us all who improved Edison's light bulb. Next slide, please. So now, beyond the design's literal interpretation, I really wanted the sculpture to also capture Latimer's essence. So here is Beacon first installed at his home in Flushing, Queens, New York, and this was in the spring of 2021. So Latimer was born in 1848. Could you go back, please, to the last slide? Thank you. So Latimer was born in 1848, and then he died in 1928. So, just imagine being a Black man in America at that time, born before the Civil War. Then years later, he joins the Union Navy and actually fights in the Civil War as a teenager. And then he lives through the short-lived gains of Reconstruction, and then every unthinkable thing that would happen following Reconstruction. So now just imagine, living in that timeline. And Lewis Latimer still dared to dream and to create and to contribute to improving the quality of not only his life and his families and the Black community, but he really wanted to improve the quality of life of everyone. And he was able to accomplish all of those things beyond all the limitations, circumstances, and conditions that he was born into and lived through. Next slide, please. So Beacon for me is really meant to reflect that divine, perpetual, radiant light and spirit of Lewis Latimer. But it's not only meant to just to reflect Lewis Latimer, it's also meant to reflect our own potential, right? That inner light that exists within each of us as well. Next slide, please. So in the spring of 2021, we received the DUMBO Brooklyn Partners Art Fund Commission to bring Beacon from the Lewis Latimer House Museum in Queens to Albee Square Plaza in Brooklyn, which is where it is now on view until the end of April. So I do hope you all plan to, at some point, visit Beacon if you haven't already, and return and bring your friends and your family and share all that you're about to learn today about Lewis Latimer with them. So I think at this point you can tell I am really looking forward to this afternoon's panel discussion. And You know, we really wanted to expand on this kind of homecoming celebration idea for Lewis Latimer. We wanted to create opportunities to come together and learn more about Latimer, learn more about our local New York history, learn more about a fellow Brooklynite, and, you know, to help us ground us in some history. Before we get into our discussion, I'd like to invite the director of the Lewis Latimer House Museum, Ran Yan, and Ran will be sharing more about Lewis Latimer's history and life's work. Thank you, Ran, for joining us.
Thank you, Shervone. I'm really happy to be here with you all and to share some historical context on who Lewis Latimer was. So like Shervone mentioned, Latimer was born in 1848, and he was born to 2 fugitive slaves. And mostly through self-education, he eventually became a master draftsman, a patent law expert, and an art enthusiast who very much enjoyed writing poems and painting. Here I would like to share a quote from one of his poems that is about the electric lighting. It says, "Like the light of the sun, it beautifies all things on which it shines, and is no less welcome in the palace than in the humblest home." Next slide, please. So to talk about Lewis Latimer, we'll have to start with his grandparents. Lewis Latimer's paternal grandfather was Mitchell Latimer, a plantation owner and slaveholder in Norfolk, Virginia, who had a son with an enslaved woman, Margaret Olmsted, in the early 1800s. Their son, George Latimer, grew up as a slave. George is pictured here on the right. In early 1828, George married Rebecca Smith, who was enslaved on a nearby plantation. Once Rebecca learned that she was pregnant, she was determined that she would not be the mother of a slave. So George and Rebecca escaped from the South while pretending to be master and slave. Not long after his arrival in Boston, however, George Latimer was recognized as an escaped slave. He was arrested and imprisoned, and an effort was made to return him to Virginia. At this news, Boston abolitionists rallied to action. Meetings were held throughout Massachusetts on Latimer's behalf, and a new abolitionist paper, the Latimer Journal and North Star, pictured here in the center, was born to detail the progress of his case. Ultimately, Latimer spent 1 month in jail. Abolitionists succeeded raising $400 to buy his freedom, which was a huge amount of money back then. Next slide, please. So the Latimer family settled down in Massachusetts. Lewis was born in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He was 12 years old when the Civil War broke out, and his older brothers joined in the Union Army. When Lewis was 16 years old, he put up his age by 2 years to join the Union Navy. He served aboard a side-wheel gunboat, which is pictured here on the right, called the USS Massasoit, and he was honorably discharged in 1865. Next, please. So when Lewis returns to Boston, he finds work as an office boy in a patent law firm called Crosby and Gould. You can see a photo of the Crosby and Gould photo here, office here on the left, and on the right is an example of the drafting tools that Latimer and other draftsmen were using at the time. So even though he started as an office boy, he was exposed to what patent drawings were and started teaching himself how to draw at night after working during the day. Next, please. Working at Crosby and Gould, Latimer became adept at drawing models, and he eventually proved himself and was promoted to be a draftsman in the firm. In 1874, he and C.W. Brown patented a device to improve the quality of bathrooms used on trains, and that would prove to be the first of many patents Latimer himself worked on. 2 years later, Latimer put his experience to work assisting Alexander Graham Bell in his effort to secure a patent for the telephone. Bell's application was filed on February 14, 1876. Several hours later, another inventor, Elisha Gray, submitted his own plans for a telephone, but was just a little too late. Bell had won the race with Latimer's help. Latimer eventually became the head draftsman during his 11 years of working for the firm, but still making much less than his white colleagues. Here are a couple examples of the patents he worked on. On the left is a patent for an apparatus for cooling and disinfection, somewhat of a prototype for air conditioner. And in the center is a locking rack for hats, coat, umbrellas. And on the right is a similar locking apparatus for bookend. Next, please. So working collaboratively with inventors like Alexander Graham Bell and C.W. Brown would inspire Lewis to further pursue engineering and inventing. In 1879, Lewis would move into the Little Liberia neighborhood in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to work directly for an inventor named Hiram Maxim. Maxim was the chief engineer at the Western Electric Light Company and would later gain his fame by inventing the machine gun. In Latimer's recounting, he was doing a short project in an office in Bridgeport, which was somewhat of the Silicon Valley of the time as the center for technological inventions and industrial revolutions. So in Latimer's recounting, Maxim came into the office and saw Latimer working on patent drawings and decided to hire him on the spot. Latimer's background in working with electric devices like the telephone prepared him for the new field of electric lighting. Latimer only worked for Maxim for 3 years, but he will make some of his most significant contributions to the electric lighting field over that short time. Next. And perfecting the incandescent light proved challenging for many inventors. The filament contained within the glass bulb lasted only a short time, and it was difficult and expensive to produce. In 1881, Latimer invented a method for manufacturing carbon filaments. His patent opened the door to a new era of artificial lighting. It propelled the commercialization of electric lighting. Latimer's work for US Electric exposed him to many new experiences. He became the company's expert on outdoor electric lighting and received several patents for improvements in the process of producing electric lighting and incandescent light bulbs. When the company moved to Brooklyn in 1880, Latimer moved with it and continued to diversify his achievements. In addition to his desk work and shop work, he went out into the field assisting in arc and incandescent installations of Maxim equipment in New York, Philadelphia, and Montreal. His work also took him to London. In early 1882, Lewis and Mary relocated to London for a year to supervise the creation of a new Western Electric factory. After his return, Latimer accepted an offer from Thomas Edison himself for employment at the Edison Electric Light Company and settled in New York. Next, please. In 1890, he authored a guide called Incandescent Electric Lighting, a practical description for the Edison system, pictured here on the right, which was one of the first field guides, or you may call it textbooks or manuals for the electric lighting technology. In 1896, Lewis became a member of General Electric's Board of Patent Control as a chief draftsman. Lewis worked for Edison and later as a patent consultant until his weakening eyesight forced him to retire. Here on the left is a photo of Lewis with his colleagues when they were working for Edison's firm. And that very brief overview completes my introduction to Latimer's professional career. If you go to the next slide, just a few more images to show. On the left is a photo of the founding meeting of the Edison pioneers. On the lower right, in the front row next to the desk is Latimer, and he was the only African American among the 28 charter members. And here on the right is a poem Latimer wrote to celebrate Edison's birthday. And with that, I will hand it back to Shervone.
Thank you so much, Ran, for giving us a fuller picture of Latimer's life, his accomplishments. And I think I feel like we just got a better sense of just him as a full person, you know, living and working and trying to pursue his personal interests and passions, which I think we all can relate to. So now what I'd like to do is spend some time exploring Lewis and Mary Latimer's time in New York. You know, there's just so many reasons why we make the decisions we make around like where we choose to live and call home. And I wanted to specifically look at what we can learn about the Latimers based on their selections of neighborhoods, like from leasing apartments in Manhattan near like West 34th Street and East 55th Street, and then moving to downtown Brooklyn area, and then finally purchasing a home in Flushing, Queens in 1902. And then now through Beacon Sculptor, Lewis Latimer is back at home again in Brooklyn. And we wanted to invite Brooklyn historian and scholar, Prathibha Kanakamedala, to share insights on the Latimer's trajectory through New York. Prathibha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shervone, and thank you to the entire team for inviting me to be part of this. There is a topic I love nothing more than talking about the history of Brooklyn, and to find that these figures in New York's history, that are very much part of our landscape, have a Brooklyn presence is always an exciting moment for me. I know when I spoke to Shervone during the sort of planning stages of this program, she was giving me a few sort of, here's the time period they were here, here's what they were up to, and completely excited because I was like, oh, there's all these connections. So I think to start off with, if I could get the slide which has the excerpt of the map, that would be awesome. I think I would start off with, in no sort of flippant or irreverent way, why are the Latimers in Brooklyn? Well, why are they not in Brooklyn? They're here from 1893 to 1902. By 1893, when they move here, you're talking about Brooklyn as a separate city, in the same way that you would talk about the city of New York, or you would talk about LA or Philadelphia. 1893 is very much pre-consolidation. And so you really are talking about a city that is thriving, that has its own economy, that has its own sort of government, and that works in its own way, and has more specifically its own rich history. Brooklyn, of course, starts out off as one of just 6 towns in Kings County at the end of the American Revolution. By 1834, it gained city status. And when I'm talking about Brooklyn, I really am talking about sort of this area here. That's all the city of Brooklyn was by 1834. The rest that you can see in this map, which was taken from 1890, so closer to when the Latimers will move to Brooklyn, didn't exist. It was very much undeveloped agricultural farmland, if you will. So that's 1834. By 1860, on the eve of the US Civil War, Brooklyn will become the 3rd largest city in the United States, right? It is behind the Manhattan, which was considered the city of New York, but the city of Brooklyn really does have its own thriving economy, and it is sugar that is making money for the city of Brooklyn. And so by the time the Latimers move, if you are a subscriber to HBO Max or you're watching The Gilded Age, and you see those scenes in which some of the main characters are living in Brooklyn, and there's a whole discussion about Brooklyn, Brooklyn really does start to look like that Brooklyn that we know and love today. It is those beautiful brownstones, those large avenues, certainly in Fort Greene. And so the Latimers are moving to something that is established, right? That is on the map. This is not sort of a city that is up and coming. This is very much a city in which people for a century have been making their fortunes. So the Latimers live specifically on Adelphi between Myrtle and Willoughby, just there, right? Today we consider it part of Fort Greene neighborhood. Back then, they were just on the outskirts of Fort Greene. Fort Greene was most definitely a neighborhood that was changing rapidly. It still had a great deal of the old frame houses and certainly the more rural elements to it. But it was fast developing into what we think of the city as today, and looked more like the city that we know, or the borough that we know today. You can see there that there's the railroad forming, or is formed, and connects people from what we call today Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, moving into downtown Brooklyn. There is Washington Park, which of course is still there today. It's not called Washington Park anymore. And so thinking about why would the Latimers have lived here, right? What was the reason to move here? Well, it wasn't just about Fort Greene as a neighborhood in itself, which again was attracting a lot of wealthier white people to those beautiful brownstones, and somebody like the Latimers to this part of the neighborhood. It was also about that connection that you can see on the other side of the park to what we call downtown Brooklyn today, and Brooklyn Heights, and certainly some of Dumbo, but not a lot by the late 1890s. That area that we call downtown Brooklyn today, where Shervone's beautiful public art piece is installed, actually has a very rich history for Black Brooklynites. It was the center of three churches, three Black independent churches in the mid-19th century, right here, Shiloh Presbyterian, Concord Baptist, and Bridge Street AWME. The first sort of anti-slavery activists, who were all Black Brooklynites in the early 19th century, from about 1805 through to the 1830s, were all living in neighborhoods we know today as Dumbo, and downtown Brooklyn, of course, was then just the village and town of Brooklyn, and then the city of Brooklyn. They're also living, the Latimers, in close proximity to, again, what we think of when we go to the borough today. City Hall is very much there. Cadman Plaza, in a very sort of infantile form, exists. And so in moving to this neighborhood, what the Latimers are really doing is what so many of us do. They're moving to a space in which they can quickly get to places of economic development, or the economic center of things, right? Because that is the city, that's the downtown bit. And they're also moving somewhere where they can quickly get into Manhattan. Manhattan has always had this historic reputation as a place in which capitalism happened, right? Wall Street was always Wall Street, the merchants, the bankers, all of that is right there in Manhattan. So being able to live in Brooklyn, right, have a bit more space, which at one point in Brooklyn's history really was the story of Brooklyn, of why you lived here, even though now it's so expensive to do so, but also be able to get into Manhattan quickly in order to be at the center of the economic hub. Again, as I mentioned, you're talking pre-consolidation. So 1893 to 1898, the Latimers are living in a large US city. They are living an urban lifestyle. By 1898, New York City will consolidate. And by that, I mean, it starts to shape and look more like the city we talk about today. In 1898, New York City will consist of 5 boroughs. It's the same 5 boroughs that we talk about today. And so Brooklyn will become just one of 5 boroughs. I find it so intriguing that 1898 is when New York City will consolidate and the Latimers will move by 1902. And I will save that piece of information as to why I think that's happening. One more thing to say about where they're living and sort of why they're here. If I could just get the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So this is Adelphi Street in Brooklyn, right? This is very much the same Adelphi Street that's in Fort Greene today. And exactly like I was talking about, it really does have, when the Latimers move here, the old remnants of Brooklyn. Here are the frame houses, or the remnants of frame houses, or squats, right? For lack of a sort of more humanitarian word around what housing should look like, but you can see the frame house there. I think if I'm squinting, that is brick. So you're starting to see the beginnings of what looks like brownstone Brooklyn in the late 19th century, early 20th century. In terms of people, why are the Latimers moving here? Well, Brooklyn has always had a thriving, active Black community. So much of what we are taught sort of through our formal education is about, if you were a person of African descent in the 19th century, that somehow automatically we must be talking about enslaved people. New York City history teaches us something that is so, not necessarily unique, but so special in that it shows us constantly in the 19th century there were free, not freed, but absolutely free Black people, people of African descent, who were living their lives with dignity and trying to establish their own humanity. They were not waiting for slavery to end in 1827, they were already free. And so they were building communities of freedom, I would argue, their own churches, their own schools, businesses, trying to buy their own homes. And so when I was looking at that video of Lewis Latimer, and his father coming and being part of the abolitionist movement in Boston, in my mind, Brooklyn was sort of an obvious choice as an adult that he would move to, even as slavery had ended in 1865. There had been a long history of organizing around abolitionism in Brooklyn. By the time the Latimers move here in the late 1890s, early 20th century, they really are among what historians call a Black middle class elite. And those are the daughters and sons and descendants of those people that I'm talking about, right? Those pioneers of activism that were living here in the early part of the 19th century. And so the Latimers are very much part of a community that exists of people like Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett, right? Daughters of Weeksville, Thomas Fortune, Samuel Scranton, Charles A. Dorsey, educators, businessmen and women, writers, journalists. There is even, in the research that I do on Brooklyn, a sort of longer history of Black inventors in Brooklyn. So not to say that the Latimers are moving here knowing all that history consciously necessarily, but certainly they're part of a long line of folks who have really been able to build their lives in a way that reflects their talents and capabilities. And in a racist economy, right, in which capitalism is key, Black Brooklynites were not always afforded that opportunity. So again, kind of obvious to me why the Latimers are here in Brooklyn. I know Shervone just wanted me to talk quickly about Albee Square because of course that's where the installation is. So I'll just finish up with that and then I'm happy to sort of hand back. Albee Square that exists today, of course, is a very different area of downtown Brooklyn. And I'm so sorry, if I could just get the previous slide so we have that map back up. Fabulous, thank you. A very different area of Brooklyn, right? Today it is completely developed. You would not be able to tell that some of these streets actually went right through, such as Duffield or Gold or Prince. Albee Square, in the way that we know it today, is very much like so many things in New York, a real estate sort of, I wouldn't say invention, but certainly a product of real estate development, founded in 2004. But as I mentioned earlier, that land, right? We are constantly walking upon the lives and the remnants and sort of other New Yorkers who came before us. That land was the center of Black activism in 19th century Brooklyn before the Latimers come. So certainly thinking about the echoes of that soil and that land and what would have been there before the Latimers arrived. And if I could just go 2 slides forward, so the next slide, and then perfect. And just to show you There is Lewis Latimer in the city directory, listed as an engineer, living at Adelphi, and it's H for home. And I wanted to take, rather than just show you the listing of Latimer in the city directory, I wanted to show you, kind of give you a feel or a flavor of what Brooklyn was like. Brooklyn was always about industry. You know, so at the top you have the real estate stuff that is going in hand. Here we go, Brooklyn City Co-op Building and Loan Association at Court Street, going hand in hand with industry and other sorts of commercialism. So you have carpet cleaners here and that sort of beautiful logo. So thinking about the Latimers, again, living in a city that is on the map, that is established in terms of both where you can live and also where you can work. Thank you so much. Shervone, am I handing back to you? I apologize.
Yes, yes, you are. Thank you so much, Preethi. You just added so much more layers to this rich Brooklyn history. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And I love seeing Latimer in the directory. Thank you for that. That was a nice surprise to see. Oh, so, you know, I'm going to do a little bit of a redirection of our conversation, just a bit. You know, I was thinking that so much of what I'm able to accomplish as an artist has a lot to do with me having a really supportive partner, right? A partner who really just understands me and offers me the space to be who I am, who encourages me to do what I do, and even pushes me at times to be a lot more bold and just bolder, I should say, and more ambitious when he thinks I'm playing it a bit too safe. And it made me think a lot about the partnership between Lewis and Mary Latimer. Just imagine we've heard a number of times already, all the things that Latimer has accomplished in his life, Lewis has accomplished in his life. And it made me think about Mary and what an amazing person she must have been and a supporter to him. And it made me want to know more about Mary too. And so I'd like to invite Rand to join us again to share more insights on the Latimers as a couple. But then more specifically, I think audience members would agree, we want to know more about Mary Wilson Latimer too. And, you know, who is she? You know, what is she doing for work? And what are her talents? And how is she educated? So if you can fill us in on some of that information, that would be amazing. Thank you, Rand.
It's really a great question, Shervone, because when we talk about historical figures like Lewis Latimer, sometimes we make the easy mistake of focusing on the individual and kind of paint a heroic picture. But as everyone here understands, it's oftentimes it's a whole support system that makes who you are. So Latimer actually met his wife, Mary Wilson, when he was working at Crosby and Gold. Mary was also from Massachusetts, and they got married on September 20th, 1873. Here on the left is a photo of Mary. So Mary did accompany Latimer throughout his career and was very well aware of Latimer's different career developments or all kinds of professional challenges and changes in his career direction. Even when they went to London, Mary was with him at every step of the way through Mary's own diary and also Lewis Latimer's diaries. We know that they are very intimately connected, and Mary often talked about what Lou was working on in her diary. And it's also through Mary's diary we learned about the racial barriers Latimer encountered when he was in London, because people there, quote, was not used to taking orders from a colored man. And there are many evidence of their loving partnership from their correspondence as well. And here on the right is the two daughters they had, Emma Jeanette and Louise. So both daughters of theirs were artistically inclined. Louise never married and taught art classes in still life and landscape painting in the house that she grew up in, which is also the museum today. And Emma Jeanette actually went to Juilliard and became a concert pianist before she got married with the Normans. If you go to the next slide, please. Here on the left is a photo of Lewis Latimer and Mary Wilson in their senior years with their daughter Louise standing on the front porch of their home in Flushing. And another example of the family's loving relationship is the many portraits Lewis Latimer did. Here on the lower right is a portrait of his daughter, Emma Jeanette, that Lewis Latimer himself drew. And on the upper right is just another adorable historic photo I really love is Emma Jeanette with a puppy sitting on the front porch of their home. Next slide, please. So when Mary passed away, Lewis Latimer was understandably heartbroken. He made sure to erect a gravestone for Mary in her family grave in Fall River, Massachusetts. And after that, partially to console their father, the two daughters put together their father's poems as a collection and self-published it as a gift to their father. In one of the many poems in the collection is called The Ebon Venus. I put it here because it was written for the wedding anniversary of Louise and Mary. If I could read it here quickly to you. The Ebon Venus by Louis Howard Latimer. Let others boast of maidens fair, of eyes of blue and golden hair. My heart like a needle ever true, turns to the maid of ebon hue. I love her form of matchless grace, the dark brown beauty of her face, her lips that speak of love's delight, her eyes that gleam as stars at night. O'er marble Venus, let them rage, who set the fashions of the age, each to his taste, but as for me, my Venus shall be ebony. So this poem is not only an expression of deep love, but it was also a song for Black beauty, a testimony for self-confidence and dignity that I think really exemplifies Lewis Latimer's personality and also his family relationships with his wife. So with that, I will hand it back to Shervone.
Oh, thank you so much, Ran. That was wonderful. Actually, I'm going to invite Preethi to join us here because I would like her to, Preethi, if you could expand a bit more on like what is the experience of Black women in Brooklyn, in New York, at the turn of the 19th century, just so that we can get a better sense of like what Mary Wilson was going through during her time there in Brooklyn. You know, just what is the quality of life for Black women at that time? If you can share about that, that would be great to hear more.
Thank you so much, Shervone. If I could get the next slide, I think that would give us more of a visual. I think it's the one with Ida B. Wells. Perfect. Thank you so much. So again, thinking about why the Latimers might have moved here, and thinking about, you know, when you move anywhere, you're looking for community, you're looking for a place to be accepted, a place in which you can thrive. And the Latimers are really no different. When they move here in the late 1890s, or the early 1890s, they really are moving to a place in Brooklyn, as I'd mentioned earlier in the program, in which the daughters, descendants of that first early 19th century wave of anti-slavery activists have come into their own, right? They are educated women in the late 1890s. Here you have in the left hand corner Maritcha Lyons, she is a young girl in 1863 during New York City's draft riots. Along with her family, her father was an abolitionist, her mother was an abolitionist, known, documented abolitionists living in Lower Manhattan. In 1863, when the horrific draft riots happen, and Black New Yorkers are being attacked by their own neighbors because of tensions that are resulting from the Civil War, Maritcha and her family will come through Brooklyn, go into Long Island, and eventually end up in Rhode Island. And so what you see in the 1860s and 1870s, because of that trauma of the draft riots, a lot of Black New Yorkers left the city. They didn't believe that this was a place for them. Some of them did move to Brooklyn, to a place called Weeksville, which today is in modern-day Crown Heights, Bedford-Stuyvesant, and was then the second largest free Black community in the United States, which boasted large amounts of property ownership, right? It was a thriving free Black community. So Maritcha sort of leaves New York completely, and when she's ready, like so many previous Black New Yorkers who had lived here, who leave post draft riots, and or other Black people, they will move to Brooklyn and really sort of rebuild their lives and the connection that they have with the city of Brooklyn, but also neighboring New York, which of course will consolidate in 1898, and all of these guys will become New Yorkers. The person here, who I love this image of her with her sort of family, is Susan, this is Susan Smith McKinney Stewart. This is Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett. They're both sisters, daughters of Sylvanus Smith, one of the early land investors in that place that I talked to you about, Weeksville. And here's Ida B. Wells, a sort of very famous image that we often see of Ida B. Wells. The reason I put these women together is because in the late 1890s, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, Sarah Tompkins Garnett, Maritcha Lyons are all organizing and mobilizing around the right for women, specifically Black women, to vote. They see the writings on the wall. When the 19th Amendment is passed, we often sort of celebrate it as women had the right to vote. Black women from the late 19th century through to the early 20th, mid 20th century are really on the front lines, because the 19th Amendment didn't allow all women to vote. It actually prevented a great deal of Black women from being able to vote. And so almost being able to see into a crystal ball in the late 19th century and trying to very much include themselves as part of this democratic experiment, saying we should have the right to vote. It is Maritcha Lyons who will invite Ida B. Wells, who hasn't built this reputation yet as a journalist and a brilliant activist, to speak in Brooklyn as part of the Brooklyn Literary Union. And again, opens up a space within a city, and especially in the North, for Ida B. Wells and her work on lynching to be heard among New Yorkers, among Brooklynites. So really giving a shout out to these, these are sort of three people that we have portraits for and names for, but actually countless Black women that were doing that kind of work in 19th century Brooklyn. When the Latimers move here, what they're really moving to, and what Mary is moving to, again, just like Lewis, is 100+ years of women's activism. Black women organizing and mobilizing very much at the center of their communities, working through institutions such as the church. But we know, right, that the church is not just a place of faith. Any religious institution is never just a place of faith. Often that same site or that same building will also act as a space for people to gather and to organize around other issues, women's rights, voting rights, sort of how do we take care of our children, how do we take care of each other's children, really growing that village. So fundraising through places like churches, but also very active in schools. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart was actually one of the first Black women doctors in the United States, and certainly the first in New York State. But it's Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett that is one of the longest serving educators in the city of New York. And so again, thinking about activism both through education, through churches, and also through businesses. When Shervone told me that before Mary becomes Mary Latimer, she was Mary Wilson, I immediately dug into sort of my research, because there was a Mary Wilson that was sort of very active in Brooklyn in the 1840s and 1850s. And she owns her own business on Atlantic Avenue. It's a clothing business. So again, kind of getting rid of our preconceived notions of what we think Black people and Black women might have been doing in the 19th century. Black women were on the front lines, opening up their businesses and understanding, right? If we are at the center of the economy, if we are building this city called Brooklyn together, we can build wealth and we can really sort of take capitalism head on and be a part of it in a way that reflects our talents and capabilities. I also found, sort of in digging around, that not just Mary Latimer would have been maybe a part of this circle, but certainly have known about these women. But Lewis Latimer as well, you know, in 1902, he writes to Mayor Seth Low arguing that the Board of Education is racist because a Black person has been removed from the board, and he writes a letter and sort of organizes around education. So again, thinking about who the Latimers were back up in Massachusetts, what their backgrounds were, that type of lineage, and how they come to somewhere that they could call home, in which they could build out so many strands of their own lives here in Brooklyn. Shervone, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Preethi, for that. Yes, I was excited to learn about that too. Latimer's petition to the mayor at that time. And apparently that same petition, he then continues to do that work, and he even presents part of that argument and more on education at the Negro Society of Historical Research. So I'm just loving to hear that, because I remember coming across that and just being like, wow, look at his activism, look at their activity in Brooklyn and in New York. So you know what, that makes me want to just get into more of Latimer's civic engagement. Rand, can you share more about just Latimer's just lifelong commitment to empowering others? I mean, through his volunteer work, his tutoring, and just all of the activism that Preethi just took us through. Would love to hear more.
Yes, so Latimer, like you all already mentioned, he was very much engaged socially and aware of the going-ons of his days. In addition to, of course, being a founding member of the Edison Pioneers, he was also a very active member of the Grand Army of the Republic, being involved in local veterans affairs and events. Yes, the slide is, on the top is a photo of a veterans event held at a public school in Flushing. Latimer is on the far right holding the flag. Additionally, he also helped found the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Queens. Again, that kind of exemplifies his New England lineage. And during his retirement, he volunteered at the Henry Street Settlement to teach immigrants English as well. So in addition to being members of those integrated groups and organizations, Latimer was, like you already mentioned, also a proud and vigorous activist for African-American rights. He was an active letter writer to many diverse friends and public figures. Next slide, please. Those regular correspondents and friends that he had included Booker T. Washington, Richard Theodore Greener, Thomas Fortune, and many others. In thanking Booker T. Washington specifically for sending a personal copy of his book, Up From Slavery, as a gift in 1904, Latimer noted that it is an inspiration to one who, like yourself, is but one generation removed from slavery and who has come up out of the depths of poverty and ignorance by his own unaided efforts. So Booker T. Washington was more or less of somewhat of a hero figure to Latimer. And also in 1895, Latimer was invited to attend a national conference of colored men in Detroit. This is what you see here on the screen. I won't read everything here, but in his correspondence, he included a couple really important declarations that he made around his beliefs in social justice. I'll just read one or two sentences here. Under number 3, because the community which permits a crime against its humblest member to go unpunished is nursing into life and strength a power which will ultimately threaten its own existence. And number 4, because our history conclusively proves that the attempt to degrade any portion, class, or race of our common people has always been fraught with more danger to the oppressor than to the oppressed. And locally, Prathi and Shervone, you mentioned his effort around the fellow Black inventor Samuel Scottron, who was removed from his seat as the only African-American member of Brooklyn's Board of Education in 1902. So it was, of course, possibly in a politically and also racially motivated shakeup. So Latimer doesn't appear to have known Scottron really well, but Scottron sent him a warm thank you letter when Latimer organized and collected some 300 signatures on an unsuccessful petition to New York City Mayor Seth Low to oppose Scottron's removal. So these are a couple examples of Latimer's activism and also his reactions to the national and local events of his days. With that, I will hand it back to you, Shervone.
Thank you so much, Rand and Prathi again. You know, just thinking about how so much of this conversation so far has just been laying down, you know, all the foundation and the groundwork around, you know, just who Lewis Latimer is and, his history, his accomplishments. But I'd like to also start to move into like, what does he mean to us today? And I'd like to finally invite Brian Cohen to join us and to share a bit more about, you know, what it means for Beam Center and Beam Center's work to be part of that continuum of Lewis Latimer's legacy, right? Of empowering others through collaboration, while also using like disciplines like the STEAM disciplines and the humanities disciplines. So the STEAM disciplines of science and technology and engineering and arts and mathematics, and bringing that together with the humanities and using that as a way to fuel innovation. So Brian, thank you for joining us. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Shervone. Thanks to everyone. I'm just mesmerized. I'd prefer to just keep listening than to have to talk myself, because it's so meaningful, powerful to hear all this rich detail about Latimer and the context in which he emerges. A little bit about Beam Center. To contextualize why this collaboration with Shervone and Ryan and Latimer himself, in essence, is so important to us and part of what we do. Beam Center believes that young people learn self-actualization and empowerment and agency through engaging in ambitious collaborative projects. And we've been doing that with young people and artists and experts for the last 17 years. You can see here on this slide, we make big things. And the reason that we do that is that we invite young people to walk inside the brain of a big thinker. And by doing so, learn the tools and techniques for making big things happen. And ultimately, we think to empower them to make their own big things happen. Shervone's project Beacon was our second New York City project. We have been making projects in the forest in New Hampshire since we started Beam Camp in 2005. You can see on the right our first New York City Beam project, also in Brooklyn, with Flipbook project under the Manhattan Bridge there. And in that case, we were collaborating with an architect, Chikit Lai from London, and an artist, Ebony Bolt from East New York, Brooklyn. This project, when we first met Shervone and saw her proposal for Beacon, we could not believe how fortunate we were to be engaging with someone who was so aligned with our own thinking and was able to teach us and the young people who came to work on Beacon about Latimer. And in the same way that just working on a big project collaboratively is important for young people to understand their own power, to be able to dive into both Shervone's vision for illuminating Latimer, but also Latimer's own history that you've been hearing about today, was so important, not only for the young people who are working on the project, but for all the people who get to engage in the project at Albee Square or at the Latimer House. In the video that was playing just before we began talking, I actually misheard Alex when she said that Latimer was put on a path to becoming an inventor himself. And what I thought she said was it put him on a path to inventing himself. And I think I prefer the misunderstanding, because that is what we do at Beam Center when we invite young people into the process of collaboration. Just so much like we heard Ren talk about how Latimer's collaboration with Maxim and Edison sparked his own invention and expansion of his own thinking and creativity. That is what we hope to inspire in the young people that work on these projects. And in this slide, you can see the process that involved so many different techniques: metalwork, electricity, mold making, and you can see the installation at the Latimer House in the bottom right. Just so striking to when we finally put up the piece in the side yard, to imagine Latimer himself looking up from one of those windows of the house and see this iconic memorial symbol of his own work, and how enduring it will be because of Shervone's work. The other thing that struck me about something Rand said was that we all know that a support system makes you who you are. And it's the other reason that we do work with young people the way that we do in this collaborative environment, and introduce them to people like Shervone and to Rand, who are so influenced and passionate about connecting the past to the future. And the experience of working with people like that does the same for young people, gives them that capacity to see themselves as part of a line, not as something that only exists today, but something that will exist into the future. So that's kind of what we do at Beam Center. And I encourage everybody to take a look at the installation at Albee Square. Also to take a look at the website that shows more about what has gone into it. Shervone?
Thank you so much, Brian. Really, just hearing you speak about our time together, looking at these images of of Holly and Blake, and I see Justin and Kevin and Joanna and Lakeisha and Gregory. Oh my gosh, it just really reminds me of our journey together. I really have. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just, you know, we weren't necessarily planning on talking about it, but the fact is that this project started in January 2020, and we started meeting with these young people, and Mitchell and Cassie and Philip from the Beam Center started working, teaching them how to weld and teaching them circuitry and mold making, and then 2 months later. We were out of touch again, but certainly in person, but we stuck with it. We continued to work with them remotely until we could come back and be together to fabricate the work starting in September of 21. Incredible journey.
It really was. I mean, it is. I mean, I just have a real deep appreciation and gratitude to you, to the Beam Center team, to all of our fellows for collaborating with me, and for us realizing Beacon together. It certainly is a career highlight for me. So please know that. Please know that. So before we move into the question and answers segment with our audience members, thank you all for joining us again. I hope you're putting your questions in the Q&A section, the tab below. I just want to again just thank all of our panelists for making just history come alive and more relevant to our times through the work that you each do. Thank you so much. I want to check in with my fellow panelists and just ask, you know, is there anything else you would like to share at this time, or questions you would like to ask one another before we move into inviting our audiences to ask their questions?
Shervone, I know I'm not part of the program of panelists, but I just want to thank
you. I
want to thank everybody for illuminating downtown Brooklyn's rich history and deepening our understanding of Lewis Latimer, not only as an inventor, but as a citizen of Brooklyn. I am just so thrilled that we were able to support this project, and having your work on Albee Square, even though Albee Square has evolved as the rest of New York City has evolved indeed, really gives us the depth of understanding that we all know we need to move forward. And it's just a deep pleasure to have your work in downtown Brooklyn, and I'm so thrilled that it'll be there till the end of April. I'm almost already getting upset that the end of April is so soon. But it is certainly for us as an advocacy group for downtown Brooklyn, a very rich experience for us. So I'm very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much, Regina. Thank you to the Downtown Brooklyn partners. Like I've said many times before, you all have, you know, by having Beacon make its presence and be installed in the Albee Square Plaza, it's a homecoming for me. So thank you for bringing me back home too, and bringing Latimer home as well.
Yeah. It really, I think learning about him today, not like I said, not only as an inventor, but as a citizen and family member and leader in Brooklyn, is really such a rich history that we deserve to learn much more about. So thank you to Preeti Ran as well for how much you have illuminated that great aspect of his history and his contributions.
Thank you.
Shervone, if I may, I have another slide left.
Absolutely, yes.
So yeah, and please everyone go visit and see Beacon at Albee Square. I would also love to invite everyone to go visit the Lewis Latimer House Museum in Flushing, Queens. We have a wide range of public programs and educational initiatives aimed at enlighten Latimer's legacy today. I think Claudette in the chat mentioned our writing series where we invite a group of Queens local writers to tell their diverse stories every year inspired by Latimer's passion for writing. It also for all the BIPOC communities to tell their stories and be the leader in their own narratives. Here's also some photos that kind of shows our educational initiatives where we work with school groups in STEAM education programs. Because Latimer was such a Renaissance man, he even back in the 19th century, he made a speech at the Bridgeport Scientific Society about how science and arts are not separated, but should be integrated and they are connected. So we try to focus on integrated STEAM projects for children and families here. So I won't bore you with more details. Please come visit, and thank you so much, Shervone, Regina, Prissy, and Brian for being part of this project.
You're so welcome, Ran. And Ran, thank you. I mean, it was your phone call to me to invite me to visit the Latimer House Museum and to be part of your program that started this entire journey. So thank you. And it was like, once I visited, it was like a spark. And I was like, okay, how is it that I do not know this amazing figure? And I did everything in my willpower to make sure that does not happen again. And that cycle is not repeated. I made sure my son knows, my whole family knows. And we're going to change that, right? We're going to make sure through all of the folks that are on this panel today, we've just expanded, and everyone who joined us, we just expanded his reach. And then it's our job to continue to share his legacy and all that he's done, because his name needs to be a household name, like his invention is a household item. So any other comments before we move into the question and answers from our audience members? Okay, so, I'd like to invite our audience members now to ask questions, pose your comments. Some of you might even have some information, some historical information to add to our conversation. Please put it in the Q&A. And I'm really grateful that we have Zaylee Lewis from Beam Center joining us and helping us and supporting us through this process of reading aloud the questions to us. Thank you, Zaylee.
Of course, thank you. I just wanted to quickly address, someone asked if they were late or if they wanted to revisit all of this wonderful information later. They can do so when we post that on the Beam Center YouTube channel. I know it will live there in perpetuity. I can also share it with Lewis Latimer House and with Shervone, downtown Brooklyn, if they want to list it anywhere, but it will be available at YouTube/Beam Center. All right, our first question actually came from Claudette. And it was a question about the points about Lewis Latimer being self-educated. And the question is how? And where did he get these materials to be this self-educated man?
That's a great question. So yeah, how did a Black person who was born whose parents were fugitive slaves taught himself how to do everything and achieve all that we talked about, right? So Latimer, he didn't receive formal education in the sense that we have today. He went briefly to the farm school, but I think it was his resourcefulness that and his incredible motivation and belief in himself that he just searched for materials. For example, when he was at Crosby and Gold, he was an office boy, but he observed the draftsman in the firm, and he saved some money and bought secondhand tools and books to teach himself and practice at night. So I think that's the kind of incredible hard work and motivation that got him where he was. Other panelists, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, just to build on what Ran is saying, in terms of historic context, we have large numbers of people who have been sort of omitted or excluded from the formal education system in the 19th century that are self-taught. If we're thinking about big figures, Emily Roebling and the Brooklyn Bridge is one of the big ones, right? That when her husband is unwell, she will kind of teach herself engineering, and it is said that it is Emily Roebling who actually finishes the Brooklyn Bridge. So thinking of groups of people that have always been excluded from formal education, there's, I know Latimer did not grow up in Brooklyn, but there's a long history of Black men who do teach themselves various trades, or various types of engineering. There is a man called Freeman Murrows who teaches himself how to kind of get something patented, and it's this paintbrush that moves like this. And of course that sounds so sort of pedestrian or normal today, but in 19th century Brooklyn, he's at the forefront of thinking about how people can paint their houses or whitewash their walls. So a long history, and the nuts and bolts of it is, I just think where there's a will, there's a way. People of color have always found ways to reestablish their own humanity. So, you ask a friend, or you sort of, there's an example of James Pennington. He wanted to be a leader in a church, so he sits outside the classes at Yale Divinity School because they won't let him into the physical classroom. They're just ways of resilience and resistance, I think, throughout, collective histories.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question that was shared was, what became of the Latimer family line in reference to future generations? So you mentioned that Mary and Lewis had 2 daughters, but then what happened?
So the second daughter, Louise, never married and never had children. And the other daughter, Emma Jeanette, had a son and a daughter. So Lewis Latimer's granddaughter, Winifred, she was actually the driving force in saving his house and preserving it and turning it into a museum. Winifred passed away in 2013. And unfortunately, there's no other direct descendant living today. But we at the museum are actually in touch with many other descendants of the broader family. George Latimer and Rebecca had multiple children. So Lewis Latimer had siblings who also had other children. And one of our board members, actually the vice chair on our board, is a great-grandnephew of Lewis Latimer, Hugh Price. I don't know if he's tuning in today, but yeah, so there is a broad lineage of Latimer descendants who are involved. We've seen received descendants as far away as California and Texas, who, when I first met them, I was just struck by how similar they look to George Latimer. It was a really interesting experience for me to see kind of, to always have that historic image of George Latimer in my mind and then see people in real life who really look like him. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Another question was about the number of things that Latimer invented during his career. Do you have that number?
I don't remember the exact number, but so he had many patents he did himself, and then he had many others he co-patented with colleagues, including many related to incandescent lighting when he was working for Maxim. Shervone, do you know?
No, I don't have the exact number on that one either. But now it makes me say, yeah, we should have, like, it would be amazing to identify a number. And I don't even think even if we did a count, I'm sure we would still be missing a few, you know?
Yes, it sounds like a great reason to visit the Latimer House Museum, or maybe do some more work with Preethi.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We invite audience members to join us in getting that number too. The Queens Central Library is open to everyone. You can go visit their archives and see his personal papers.
And actually, one of our guests, Mary, in the chat just gave a shout out to the Schomburg Museum in Harlem at 135th
Yes.
Street as another great resource for the history of Latimer and other noteworthy people of color.
Matter of fact, Rand, am I correct that that was a colleague of Schomburg, was a colleague of Latimer, and he had Schomburg at his house in Queens at some point when he used to do gatherings? He and Mary used to host gatherings at his house. Am I correct about that?
I don't remember Schomburg being one of the guests, but he might have been. I don't remember every guest names that were mentioned.
Sorry.
No worries. Another great resource, if you would like to look into his patents, it's actually the Rutgers University. Their Edison papers also include many patents done by Lewis Latimer, and their digital archive is accessible online. One of their staff was also interviewed in that video we played at the beginning.
And it's just to add, if you can't physically get up to the Schomburg because you're not in the city, maybe you've come in from somewhere else, that a great deal of the holdings are now digitized, and it's in a beautiful database that you can find stuff easily. So absolutely, shout out to the Schomburg and just New York Public Library in general, where you can get a lot of the digital collections like at Rutgers as well.
Thank you. Another guest has asked about the Edison Electric company, or that project. The Edison Electric powered the city of Newburgh in the Hudson Valley after Pearl Street. He's asking if there's any information that connects Latimer to the Newburgh project with Edison Electric, because there was a thriving Black middle class in Newburgh at the time. He's just curious if there has been any documentation of a connection there.
I'm not aware of it, but we are actually in an active process of doing more research into Latimer's life, where there are still some gaps that we would like to learn more about in preparation actually for our new permanent exhibition at the Lewis Latimer House Museum, which we're planning to launch for Latimer's 175th birthday in September 2023. So we're learning new things every day too. So I hope you'll join us when we have the new exhibition.
Thank you, Ran. Another question is asking about the distinction between Edison's role with the light bulb. So the saying is that Edison invented the light bulb, but Latimer is responsible for the carbon filament creation. Can you talk about how, or rather why, Latimer isn't credited with making a working light bulb, or the distinction there?
I think it's always tricky to attribute an invention or one type of technology to one individual person. In the case of electric lighting, you know, there was Thomas Edison, there was Hiram Maxim, and many, many others who were working on similar technology at that time. And Latimer's contribution, or one of his most important ones, was the process to manufacture carbon filaments, which was a big step in the commercialization of light bulbs and incandescent lighting, and also making it practical and affordable to more people at that time. So I don't think it's fair to attribute the technology, the invention of electric lighting, to one specific person. Shervone, what are your thoughts on this?
So am I correct that the question is, why? Could you say the question one more time, Zaylee?
Yes, just that
sure.
there's, everyone credits Edison with making the light bulb, but then there's the statement that Latimer cleaned up or improved the carbon filament and the process. So just where the credit lies and all of that.
Yeah, that's been the controversial part. and that's why Beacon exists. I mean, I think Rand said most majority of it, so I won't be saying anything really new. It's just that it's timing, right? That's always been the challenge, right? When you're ahead of your time. He was an innovator, and he created at the time when, you know, a Black man in America having the right to invent and patent his own invention and get credit for it and earn royalties on it didn't happen at the time. And so he never earned royalties on this. But it would be, I think that's one of the things that we envision, right? That doesn't happen going forward, and that there is a way for us to make sure that he gets recognized for this invention that has completely transformed our lives. And we still use it to this present day.
Thank you, Shervone. I have one final question that we'll do before we start wrapping up. Beacon specific. Do you have any kind of insider information, any details about what's happening next for Beacon?
Oh gosh, okay. So this is what we're cooking up. This is what brings us together. So this conversation is one where we get to share with folks just the history and the layers. But another thing that we're working on is trying to see if we can have Beacon trace the footsteps of Lewis Latimer. So our goal is to be able to take Beacon and travel Beacon to Bridgeport, Connecticut, right? And then it would be amazing if we can get Beacon to travel also to Boston. So, you know, just take that trail, or Chelsea, you know, just take the trail. And then even a bigger goal would be to be able to take Beacon to Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia, where his parents freed themselves. Wouldn't that be something? So that's our goal, and that's what we're working on. And so audience members, if you have any ideas on how we can make all of those things happen, it does take a collective to make something ambitious happen. Clearly, as you can see, with what we've been able to do so far, we've accomplished 2 sites. So I feel like we accomplished it in a pandemic. So, you know, things are possible for sure, but we can always use the help of others. And so again, just inviting you all that the conversation definitely doesn't end here, it continues. And I do hope that you will stay in touch with each of us. And if you have any way of supporting us through that endeavor, please. But first and foremost, start by visiting Lewis Latimer House Museum and just see what started this journey for me. I mean, it was an amazing visit. First of all, it's just a beautiful area to be in, but visiting the house and sitting in the garden is just really a beautiful day. You could spend a day there. It's just lovely. There's great food options in the neighborhood. And then make your way to see Beacon in Albee Square Plaza and take classes with Beam Center, hang out and do activities at the downtown Brooklyn partners. And you should sit in on some of Preethi's conversations coming up. And I'm gonna pass it to you, Brian.
All right, thanks, Shervone. I'm gonna put a date on that coming visit to Albee Square. There's going to be an Earth Day celebration, I believe, Regina, April 23rd. We encourage, Beam Center will be there, Latimer House will be there, and we'll have activities for people of all ages, so we hope you'll join us on that day. And before we go, a lot of thank yous here. This has been an amazing event. I enjoyed it as an audience member as much as anything. A big thank you to Zaylee Lewis for not only keeping us on time and curating and voicing the questions, but handling all the back end. Thank you to the people who work with Shervone to make Beacon happen. Mitchell Dose, who's with us, Philip Castillo, Cassie Broadus-Foote, and the Beam Fellows, Beam Project Fellows. Regina, thank you so much for making it possible to bring it home, bring Shervone home. Hopefully, I believe we can still get some mixtapes nearby on Albee Square. Thank you to the Downtown Brooklyn Art Fund. Thank you, Johari and ConEdison for their assistance in making this project possible. Also, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, National Endowment for the Arts, thank you for joining us here today. This has been an amazing event. You can catch Beam Center in many places. We have a shop in Red Hook. We have a shop on Governor's Island. On August 21st and actually August 20th and 21st, we'll have our Inventionuity Festival. We encourage everyone to join us there. I think that's it. Thanks so much. Thanks, Shervone, Preeti, Ran, Regina. Wow, good one. Have a good rest of the Sunday.
Thank you all for such a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Be well.